Today, I'm going to talk about the reasons that, associate salaries and the problems with them and how it's causing quite a few problems in the legal profession, I think. And this has been going on for a long time. And I've watched it really do a lot of damage to law firms, to the careers of associates and lots of different people. This is a fairly important discussion today. And I think if you're with a law firm, it will give you some points to think about in your recruiting efforts and what your firm wants to do with salaries for the most part, and also explain to you a lot of the reasons that certain things are happening with salaries and why they continue to go up. And I'm sure that they're probably due for a salary increase about right now. So what happens is that the economy typically will start doing well. And at this point in time, the economy is doing well. And then when the economy is doing well, it becomes much more difficult for mainly corporate law firms that are heavily corporate to hold on to attorneys. And so the attorneys will go in-house, or they'll go to other jobs, or they'll move to more prestigious firms. And when this starts happening, what'll happen is one or two firms will start raising. Usually one firm will raise the salaries, and then other firms, in order to remain competitive with that firm and to have the best brand name among associates and so forth, will start raising their salaries. And pretty soon different firms are left out of the salary increases. Then they start feeling like they need to increase theirs as well. And even smaller to mid-size firms started, experiencing a lot of pressure to increase their salaries. The firms that don't raise their salaries when this happens, and there's always a few, the brand suffers. Their brands aren't considered as good as them in the market. They start to suffer from defections, meaning people start leaving. They have a hard time holding on to associates. People won't work as hard. You'll have lots of offers that are given to law students and others that won't be accepted. And the brands are weakened. It's just what happens. And so many times those same firms will end up raising their salaries very quickly after they realize the damage has been done, but sometimes they don't. And I personally think that these salary wars that happen, I've watched them happen, by the way, numerous times. I watched them happen in the 90s. I watched them happen in the early 2000s. I watched them happen several times in the 2000s. And then I watched them happen more recently, and they just keep happening. I believe that they're very destructive. In some respects, I'm not practicing law anymore because of salary wars. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But they've ended a lot of careers. They've prevented lots of careers from getting started. They've created a lot of problems for attorneys and people that normally would have thrived and done well under more normal market conditions. So these salary wars are very dangerous for attorneys. And so I'm going to discuss, and also for law firms, of course, and the clients that they serve. I'm going to discuss some of the problems with the salaries. And I did a podcast on this recently, and after the podcast, I even thought of more things, the reasons that it hurts people. But I'm going to discuss, some of the problems today about the salaries and why, when this happens, it can be very dangerous. And the other thing to keep in mind is once the salaries start going up, what almost always happens is there's a recession in a short time later. There's almost always a recession, and it's usually within a couple of years of the salaries increasing. And then what happens is when the salaries increase and there's a recession, there tends to be like mass layoffs in law firms. Many partners are asked to leave. Many counsel lose their jobs. There's always a lot of people in law school. People will decide to go to law school when the salaries are increasing, and then those same people will come out and won't have jobs, but will have a lot of loans. There'll be tension between partners and associates because partners will expect them to work harder. In many cases, junior associates will be making more money than senior associates and even junior partners. It will create it creates a lot less demand for billable hours, less loyalty in the firm, and associates become more fungible. The law firm becomes less willing to train them, angry about the salaries. There's less client satisfaction many times because there's a less sense of loyalty. The clients are paying more money for services, and there's more turnover inside of the law firms and other problems. So these salary increases create a lot of problems. And I'll talk about a lot of them today. So the first thing is that in most cases, the salary wars don't have a real connection with the market in most practice areas. They do have it in some practice areas, but not others. But the problem is when salaries increase, they increase them for all practice areas. Typically, what happens is there's most of the salary wars that I've seen happen are happening because there's a war and there's a major competition for the best corporate attorneys. And when the economy is doing well, there's lots of deals being done, there's businesses being started, businesses need work, and there's just a lot of demand. And there's typically not as many good corporate attorneys out there to do the jobs. So law firms will start doing things like paying starting bonuses, and then they'll raise salaries, and they'll do whatever they can to attract the best corporate attorneys. And the idea is that if they're paying enough money to the corporate attorneys, then they won't leave to go in-house or to go to work in more prestigious firms, because when the economy is really good, a corporate attorney could basically move to a much more prestigious firm than they're currently at. So that's very helpful, obviously, for law firms when they have the ability to raise salaries, when they have the ability to attract people. They'll many times lower their hiring standards. And it's significant. They will lower them during the recession, the boom that happened between 1999 and 2000. There were major law firms in New York City, like good ones, like Sherman and Sterling and others, that were hiring at a Pace Law School and things, because Pace is a good law school. I'm not criticizing it, but it's typically not the type of law school that the most prestigious firms in New York are hiring from. So the idea is that those firms, by raising salaries, would hopefully hold on to people and not have to, dig too deep for people. But the thing I'm talking about today is corporate attorneys. So the demand is almost always for corporate attorneys. It's not for litigators, for example. And in general, there's always more than enough litigators, and law firms wouldn't need to raise their salaries to attract litigators. I'm talking about corporate attorneys, and corporate work it's a very tedious. It's not litigation can be tedious too, but it's often the type of work that corporate attorneys do is very sophisticated clerical type work, but it requires a lot of thought. But it's doing a lot of filings and things for companies and putting together deals, and that work, when the economy is doing well, it just reaches a fever pitch. It gets very hot. There's not enough corporate attorneys to go around. The law firms are doing everything they can, and they need people because companies, there's a lot of money involved. Companies are willing to pay for it. So the law firms want to do everything they possibly can to hold on to these attorneys and also to hire new ones. They'll lower their hiring standards. But the thing is that when the salary wars start, you have to remember that corporate is a practice area there's a lot of corporate attorneys, of course, in New York and in the Bay Area, and those are some big practice areas for it. But the most of the country, the corporate is not the largest practice area. It's not the largest practice area in DC. It's not the largest practice area in Chicago. Most of the most popular practice areas are litigation and intellectual property, to a lesser extent, real estate, and other practice areas. But the thing is, when they need to raise the salaries of corporate attorneys, they do it for every practice area, which to me is almost backwards from the way it should be. Why would you raise the salaries of attorneys that you don't in practice areas where there's not this much demand and where you're not facing the same pressure? And law firms don't, face the pressure of litigators jumping ship, or the real estate attorneys and all these other people. They face it of corporate. But they only raise it for all practice areas. And so I just don't get it. Why do you need to do that in Washington, D.C. when that's not a corporate area? It just doesn't make any sense to me. The litigator, employment attorney, others may only be billing 1,800 hours a year. That's not a lot of work. May also believe, because they're part of the same group, the same law firm, that they need to have their salaries really increase. But I just don't think it's justified in most cases. There's just not the economics of raising the salaries of the least busy and productive members of a firm just doesn't make a lot of sense. But this is just what happens. It's how it works. And it's not something that really happens in other practice areas or in hospitals or in other practice settings. For example, with doctors, I know my cousin is an orthopedic surgeon. She did that because she wanted to make a lot of money. So she went into a practice area where she made a lot of money. I have other relatives that are just general practice doctors in the same cities, and they make 1/4 or 1/5, what the orthopedic surgeon is. If someone goes into and they both work in hospitals. It's in most practice areas that most specialties that doctors do, they get different amounts of money in the same hospital and the same physician group. But I just don't understand why law firms need to pay everyone of the same class share and stuff the same. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And that to me seems like a major inefficiency in the market because corporate will always slow down. And when it slows down, corporate attorneys expect to be paid the same. And the other problem that happens is when the law firm needs to raise the salaries of everyone, it's not just you need to raise the salaries of your first year attorneys. If you raise the salaries of your first year attorneys, you need to raise your salaries of your second year and your third year and your fourth year. So it's like your cost could be, it's not just raising it of 20 attorneys, it's raising it of 200 attorneys. It's nuts. And what happens is then the billing rates of the clients need to increase. And so when you increase the billing rates, you're making it harder for partners to hold on to clients. And if you're making it harder for partners to hold on to clients, then the partners will need, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it works. It ultimately does work. But the thing that happens is because of the needing to, everybody feeling like they need to make the same salaries, what happens is a lot of practice areas where the attorneys aren't billing as much, which could be, or the billing rates are lower, and you can't raise the billing rates. The law firms need to pay people different rates. So an example would be employment law. Like in the employment law, a lot of times there's a lot of advisory work. There's a lot of competition from national employment firms that can charge lower rates. And so it's very difficult for a lot of law firms to continue having employment law as a practice area because when the billing rates increase and they need to increase the salaries, it just doesn't make sense for them to pay these huge salaries. And it's very common, by the way, for an employment attorney that works in a major law firm to make 2 and 3 times as much as they would in normal in most law firms. And therefore, the clients won't pay for it, and law firms end up throwing out their employment departments. And it's very common. Many law firms now only do like class action litigation, for example, in the employment context. They won't do employment law. And so a lot of the less work gets done in the law firm. And so there's a lot of pressure on law firms for certain practice areas to keep the rates low. One of them is employment. Another one now, a lot of work that's being done is in patent prosecution. So in patent prosecution, there's a lot of pressure for flat rate billing. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense for law firms to continue paying hourly salaries and high salaries to patent attorneys doing flat rate billing. And so what the law firms now are doing is a lot of people are being made into, in order to keep this kind of different billing structure, there's an increasing use of staff attorneys, which I'm not criticizing one way or another. I don't know that that's bad, but that's so that you have multiple classes of attorneys inside of a law firm. And then I think that because of these salary wars, what ends up happening is law firms become the ones that have to raise their salaries, become more inefficient and less competitive. If I was a law firm, and I'm not, but I would certainly study how do you raise the salaries of only the people where there's demand, the corporate attorneys, or people that are billing all these hours. You give them special incentives and tell them they can make a lot more money working for you as opposed to another firm that's paying them these high salaries. I don't know. I would think through the process instead of just raising the salary of hundreds of attorneys at one time. It just doesn't make sense to me. And because you're really increasing the cost of doing business, you're making yourself less competitive to your clients and more. It's just not my idea of things the best idea. The reason is if the salaries are increasing, it becomes much difficult for attorneys in slow practice areas where there's not a lot of ongoing work to get jobs because of the increased cost of doing business. So many times law firms will have trust and estates departments, or they'll have bankruptcy departments that are not heavily staffed, and that makes it difficult. If a law firm's not corporate dependent and they only do litigation, this can make it much more difficult for them as well to get work and to keep their associates busy at the high, they need to pay them higher rates. And it means that the associates will, if the salaries are higher, they'll expect their associates to work harder. And this pressure to bill all these hours and stay active is not healthy for people. It's certainly the way the legal profession is, and there's nothing going to change, but it's they're needing to work so hard in order to justify your salary, and having all these people that will take your place just for money, it can be stressful, and it's not good for people all the time. And some people actually thrive on it, so I'm not saying it's not good for everyone, but it's not always good. The other thing it can do is it can create resentment in the corporate departments, because the corporate departments, when they're very busy, many times are supporting all these other practice areas. And so corporate attorneys are bringing in all this work, but then they're seeing litigators not generating as much money. And oftentimes corporate groups will leave and pick up and go to other firms because they don't feel like they're being treated as well. in their existing firms. And it can also give attorneys who are not carrying their weight in slow practice areas an exaggerated sense of their value. I talk to attorneys all the time that are at these firms, and they may be doing something like, I don't know, some practice area that where they're not generating a lot of money, like trademark, for example. And they seem to think that they're very valuable, even though they may not practically be generating anywhere near their value in terms of the revenue to the law firm. That's not good either. It can really do a lot of damage, and then people start believing that they're entitled to certain salaries despite not really contributing much, and then it creates all sorts of problems. So in most cases, I believe that law firms should raise salaries, but only in the practice groups that are busy. And in most cases, what's happening is corporate is really the practice area that's driving it, the salary increases, not other practice areas. And it doesn't make sense to raise the salaries of all your attorneys because of that. And if I was a law firm, I would really look at a way to do that. And then the other thing that they do is they increase the cost of doing business for the law firms that should not be increasing the cost of doing their business. And what that means is there's nothing wrong with certain law firms paying high salaries to attract the best talent. And for law firms that can afford to do, there's definitely nothing wrong with that. You have some firms, it's typically like Cravath that starts the salary wars, and then Wachtell that pays the highest bonuses. And so there's certain firms out there that really attract a very high caliber of attorney that's very suited to practicing law. And they really do hire very well. They rarely even hire outside of their summer programs, and they bring in people that they tend to do very well there, and they're just very good at hiring. And these are immensely profitable firms that have huge institutional clients that stick with them. They enforce standards of behavior and things because they have such strong cultures. They don't water down by lateral hiring of the wrong people, and they have massive work expectations, and people go there knowing what they're going to get. And so these firms, there's nothing wrong with having a separate universe of firms. And you have certain firms that are going to pay a lot of money. And it doesn't mean not every firm can be Cravath and have the kind of institutional clients they have. It's just not how it works. And certain firms should be increasing, can definitely raise their salaries. But the fact is, most law firms are not Cravath. They haven't been servicing IBM and giant clients like that forever, doing their most sophisticated work. And the best attorneys, the very, very best attorneys, the ones that can work anywhere, aren't going to go to every firm in the Am Law 100 or smaller firms. And most clients of the firms are cost sensitive, even large firms. Sullivan and Cromwell, for example, they used to just send a bill with a number on it. And if you asked them to what the hours were and to send proof of it, they would huff and say, sure, no problem. And they would send it. But it was almost beyond that, because this is the kind of work that they were doing. So these are firms that just operated, that start these salary wars, that are operating in kind of a different universe. And Wachtell pays their first year associates more than the majority of partners make in law firms around the country. And they typically take fixed fees. So there's these firms paying these huge salaries are ones that can do it. And there's always going to be your top 1% and everything. But the problem is when those law firms raise their salaries in order to believe that they need to attract the exact same caliber of people, they start raising their salaries too. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with people paying as much, but many of these salaries shouldn't be playing these games. And law firms that go out of business many times, the reason they go out of business is because they give these salary guarantees to partners and they have lines of credit. And it's like someone who's already deeply in debt purchasing expensive car and going on an expensive vacation to keep up with the neighbors, or athletes using illegal drugs. And, they're just doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing. And what they're doing is often going to have adverse consequences in the future. And certainly not every law firm that pays high salaries is getting itself in trouble. And they're certainly attracting the right people, but many times they shouldn't. The salary wars that happen, they're often started by firms that they raise the cost of doing business for firms that may not necessarily be dependent on doing sophisticated corporate work. They may be in other practice areas and other practice settings. Most firms that raise their salaries, and there's almost always a backlash against it. And what happens is when you raise your salaries for all your other practice groups, the economy is going to slow down, and then you're going to have to lay people off. And Cravath, by the way, doesn't lay people off. Sullivan Cromwell certainly laid people off, maybe in staff roles before, but it's never laid people off like our attorneys. So just paying these salaries cannot make a firm, the ones that are starting these salary wars, into one of these firms. Okay. And then the next thing is that what almost always happens when a firm starts raising their salaries is they almost always lead to mass layoffs in many firms. There are soft layoffs and hard layoffs and publicized layoffs. But what happens is when a firm starts aggressively raising salaries, pretty much what'll happen is, that lots of careers will be destroyed because it's just what happens. About every 8 years, there's a recession, and it's pretty much worked like that forever. And I don't know why the economy works that way, but almost every 8 years there's a big recession. And the firms that are raising their salaries have giant corporate clients where they can basically bill them, and those clients will not raise an eyebrow. They'll just pay the bill. And most firms, even most firms in the AmLaw 100, are not like that. Their clients will question bills, they'll fight about bills, but these firms, and certainly people fight with these firms about bills, but they have plenty of work to do, and they're always going to have plenty of work, and they can raise salaries. But most firms that raise salaries, again, are like people using high interest credit cards. They're going to get themselves at some point into serious trouble because there's different issues. They're dependent on lots of partners with individual clients and books of business. And the reason that law firms are getting in trouble is because the real demand is typically only in corporate. So corporate's a practice area that moves in tandem with the economy. So when the economy's good, like I said earlier, corporate gets very busy because people are doing deals and starting businesses and buying businesses and so forth. And corporate gets very active all over. But when it slows down, corporate comes to a complete standstill many times. Many times, there are firms that get so slow in corporate that, and this is something I shouldn't even be talking about because these are my clients, but there are firms that get so slow in corporate that they may hire like 30 corporate associates, and they will take their entire first year corporate associates and put them in a separate building when the economy's slow because there's no work for them to do. And they know that they're going to have to let them go. It's scary. And it gets very slow when the economy slows down. And then the law firms will aggressively let corporate people go. Corporate people can't find new jobs. And it just, the market, the work almost always dries up. So corporate is feast to famine. And when the economy is slow, it always gets bad. And then the law firms that increase their salaries when things were going well always have to start looking for savings. And so the first savings is usually with corporate because corporate, there's just no work. So then all those corporate attorneys that are working very hard end up losing their jobs. And it always happens. I've seen it happen at least 3 or 4 times in the past couple of decades. It just keeps happening. And they'll let entire classes go. The corporate attorneys will just all lose their job at once. And it's just not a good situation. And not only do corporate attorneys lose their jobs when this happens, but what also happens is these same law firms will often take the opportunity to let other attorneys go that are, just one second. The same law firms will let other attorneys go that may be in slower practice areas but receive raises during this period of economic optimism when corporate was funding so much work. They'll let attorneys in all different sorts of practice areas go that aren't busy. So they may have tried to invest in doing more work in a different departments or so forth. But when the economy slows down, that's what happens. They'll start laying off people in other departments unless the people really do have a lot of work. And layoffs are pretty brutal and severe. Most of the time, honestly, the layoffs that happen, I did write that it doesn't matter whether they went to law school or how good their previous positions were. Many times they will hold on to their top attorneys, the ones that it's much more difficult to get laid off if you went to Harvard Law School than it is to get laid off if you went to Michigan. And so they will be somewhat selective in terms of how they lay people off. But if there's any kind of black mark in the person's background, the hours were ever low, there were bad reviews and stuff, they will be very happy to let them go. And when I say these layoffs are brutal, I'm not exaggerating. These are it's because I see it from where I'm sitting. When people are looking for jobs, there are just tens of thousands of attorneys that at one time were doing very well, just lose their positions, and there's no positive reception in the market. No one will interview them, and they often end up leaving the practice of law, or they take the sorts of jobs they never believed that they would have. And it's very depressing for them. And these recessions are incredibly brutal in the major markets for corporate. In New York and the Bay Area, for example, I would say 75% in some of these cases of the junior mid-level attorneys end up getting let go. And these are major firms. And then other practice areas are let go too, because everyone is cleaning house at the same time and letting people go. There's just no jobs. And people leave these areas in droves. Lots of people, there's always lots of divorces. There's people that were suddenly able to support families and are no longer able to, and they're upset and discouraged, and people get confused, and it's hard. I hate to be so dramatic about any of this, but I've seen it just happen so many times, and I've known lots of people that have been very hurt by this, and it's just kind of lots of people don't think they're going to get cancer, have a heart attack or a stroke, but statistically, these things do happen to people, and happen to most people at some point. Something negative will happen, and so it's the same thing with attorneys. Like, a lot of them don't think they're going to deal with this, and I see it all the time when it happens, and it's sad. And I see attorneys that I was talking to before that were very arrogant and dismissive, and all of a sudden they're begging for jobs, and they go into almost from being on top of the world to unemployable. So it's definitely not the greatest situation when that happens. And then the next thing is that the careers of partners, counsel, and other associates also become far less secure. What ends up happening is these partners and associates will also be let go. So, most older law firms have a lot of dead weight. They have people there that are not necessarily bringing in business. Those people are often let go. They've been able to stay with their law firms by being on committees and they're doing all sorts of things. But when this work slows down, everyone's looking for ways to save money. And so these attorneys are often let go. And so that's not good for people. And all sorts of departments are caught. I would also caution people are on this call that even major law firms will let go their recruiting department. No, it's not good. I've seen that happen, and I've seen just lots of bad things happen when it happens. And the point, but with partner and counsel level attorneys, they have families and children and kids in school and obligations, and their sense of identity is often tied up with their jobs, but everything just comes crashing down, and the value that these partners and counsel may have had no longer matters when these layoffs start. So that's how that works. That's not good. And then the other thing that I see is that the law firms continue to pay new associates and do new hiring at law schools because they have to maintain, an image or something. But they continue to pay their new associates lots of money. They continue to keep the same salaries. I mean, some of them do lower them. I have seen that happen, and I saw that happen even during COVID at some points. But for the most part, they continue paying high salaries, and then they lay people off that were kind of part of the firm for a long time. And many times the junior attorneys that don't have the same ability are given work over more senior attorneys, and the work's not done as well. So that also is a strange thing that ends up happening. And then the other thing that happens when the salaries increase is that the law firms begin to have a lot less tolerance for on-the-job learning and mentoring junior associates because they're paying very high salaries. And this is another very real thing. In most cases, the majority of associates, not all, but the majority of associates really don't know what they're doing until they've been practicing law for at least a few years. It takes so long. People learn at different speeds. I've hired people before that were hors de cour from top 10 law schools working here, and it took them a while to as attorneys to learn what they should be doing. And so people just learn at much different speeds. And most law firms need to write off a lot of the hours of junior attorneys too, because those attorneys are often learning on the job and is efficient. But when the salaries increase a lot, what those same law firms do is they start having a lot less tolerance. They just believe that if we're paying all this money, these people should be up to speed very quickly. And they're looking for reasons not to like them and not reasons to let them go. And the reviews often become harsher if for the same people, unless they really need them. And law firms expect them to work more hours and work harder and make fewer mistakes. And so it's just a lot of stress all around. And they will be very clear with these junior associates and others. They need to bill a lot of hours. And then associates start learning that the quality of their reviews is more important than the hours. Partners don't want to take time to mentor many of them. And then I think there's just less of a bond between the attorney and the law firm. The attorney knows they could lose their job at any moment. The law firm knows that they can go out on the market and find someone else if they don't like this person. So the relationship becomes more strained, and it's just, so they begin making everyone is less loyal. People are more unhappy, and it's not as good of a situation as it should be. And then, unfortunately, what happens is because attorneys, they get the message from their law firm that the law firm doesn't care about them. There's not a lot of training many times. The the law firm is happy to just hire laterally, which is obviously what I do for a living, but they're forced to bill a lot of hours. The reviews are often very harsh, and so attorneys will leave. So there's just a lot of turnover. Associates will leave, and a lot of it, I think, comes back to these salaries, and then they get a major distaste for the practice of law. All of these sites like Greedy, all these sites where attorneys go and complain and about their jobs. I own one of them, so top law schools, but they all merged when the salaries started increasing in the 90s. There wasn't really anything like them before. The first one was called Greedy Associates, and I actually knew the attorney that started it, and I was their first advertiser. But it was bought by Fine Law, I think, and then just withered away. But the point is that attorneys will go to these websites and all these and compare salaries and then complain about their jobs. And this all started when the salary started increasing. It wasn't really happening before. So that's how it is. And then the other thing is that the practice of law becomes more of an endurance game where attorneys are expected to give it their all and justify their existence. And even in feudal times, serfs were allowed to leave the fields at night and go home and sleep with their families. But major law firms, they arguably lead much less balanced and healthier lives than serfs did 500 years ago. And the majority of attorneys that I know that have lasted in major law firms until their mid-40s often have lots of health problems or sometimes psychological problems, family problems, sometimes substance abuse problems. And you wonder to yourself, like, how could they not with the kind of requirements of these law firms? Because their life becomes a constant struggle for survival. And the other thing, and I don't know that this is that bad of a thing, but a lot of these attorneys never get that comfortable in their jobs. And what happens is they're wondering what's going to happen if they don't bill enough hours, and they become many times very upset because there's just not a lot of assurances that they can continue with their jobs for a long period of time. And then the other thing that happens, should be obvious, but it's not necessarily, is that when salaries increase in law firms, the law schools start enrolling a lot more attorneys who really will end up graduating and be disappointed because there's no jobs when they get out. So once salaries start increasing, these attorneys will often, new attorneys will often start seeing dollar signs, and they'll enroll in law school in droves. And the law school enrollments will start increasing, and when that happens, there won't be jobs. And if you go to a top 10 law school, obviously, or 15 law school, the majority of these attorneys will get jobs. But the further down the line attorneys go, the more difficult it will be to get jobs. And then enrollments will spike generally. The most people will start going to law school around the same time the legal recession hits. And then when the legal recession hits, the legal job market is often very unforgiving. And so these students will graduate into a career that isn't necessarily welcoming to them. They'll have a lot of debt, and they'll end up working as contract attorneys in jobs that they don't enjoy, and they'll become almost second-class citizens in the profession. So that's not helpful. And I talk to people every day in my job that I think that have been enormously successful if they've been in other professions. They might have very good sales skills, or they might have been talented musicians, or they might have been doctors and then gone to law school, and all sorts of things happen. And then they go to these law schools and they emerge with no other prospects. And it's not always the right thing for attorneys. And I talk to attorneys, hundreds of attorneys a month, and the majority of ones that I speak to, I think, would have been much more successful if they hadn't gone to law school, because the profession can become very unwelcoming. And people go into law school in many cases in search of money, and the money from these high jobs and paying jobs is not necessarily secure. And ultimately, a lot of people that end up doing well are the banks who loan people money. And then I think that one of the big things that I think is that the promise, because when these salaries increase so high, attorneys, especially when they're young, will look at the starting salaries and they'll think this is a ton of money. And so it often attracts the wrong people. So a lot of future attorneys will go to law school for for financial reasons, and they may be smart and be able to test well and get into law schools. But the problem is that the core motivation for being an attorney, in my opinion, should be an interest in looking out for others. You have to have kind of a natural interest in helping other people, and whether it's an individual, a corporation, or a group. But attorneys that are motivated by money are often just looking out for themselves, and that can hurt them. They should the best attorneys have like an intrinsic motivation for helping solve the problems of others. It doesn't matter if it's a corporation that they're solving it for, a person. They're just very motivated by that. They're not necessarily motivated by their own self-interest, and they're interested in taking the side of other people. And these are the characteristics that I have found make the best attorneys that are happy with a position, because you have to be interested in that sort of thing. And then when someone that's very ego-centered and is only giving of themselves for a certain reward and so forth, and is more focused on that than their contribution, they typically don't do wrong and do well. And a lot of these attorneys that enter the profession because they want to make money as a prime motivating factor are not the right people to do it. I would say if you look back in history, most in the 1950s, even the 1960s and 70s, most people went to law school not for financial reasons, but because something about being a professional and an advisor and stuff appealed to them. And it was never about, certainly for some people, it may have been about money, but the salary increases and so forth that occurred really weren't about it then. And now, for many young attorneys, money is a motivating factor. And I think if you're motivated by money, there's nothing, the world works the way it does. And so I'm not criticizing people for being motivated by money, but there's professions where the money motivation actually serves you much better. So that can often be finance or business and sales and some different types of management many times. But that particular type of profession isn't always going to be, this profession isn't the best if you're motivated by money. Even the most successful partners that I know in many law firms, the ones that are making into the seven figures, they're motivated by principles or the work. They're not motivated by money. And young attorneys that are coming into things motivated by money, it's just not often a good comp. And so when a law firm is made up of people there because they're most concerned about money, then the law firm management will start demanding off lots of hours. It will make the jobs of the attorneys less secure. It will stop caring about developing the attorneys. It will care more about making sure that they're bringing in money, and there's more of a emphasis on being a profit center as opposed to a cost center, and less on learning and so forth. And my business involves, of course, moving partners and associates from firm to firm. And the real exploitation, because the money often is because partners are often, because they rely on that revenue to pay associates and to pay other partners, but they're often the ones that are really exploited in terms of the economics. They're often paid, the law firm will pay them as little as they possibly can to prevent them from leaving and justify them. A lot. I had a partner I was talking to not too long ago that I think she had $3.5 million in business, and she was paying $200,000 by a law firm. And that's pretty major exploitation. And she didn't even realize that they kept her in the dark, that she wasn't making enough. And she was a junior partner, but people are often exploited. And an example would be the partner that starts out may have a few $1 million in business, will be paid $600,000 a year. A couple of years later, they may have $3 million in business and be paid the same. And then the law firm will start giving them excuses of why they can't pay them more, or sometimes their compensation's even cut. So I think that partners are taken advantage of quite a bit in the legal market, and it's just the way it is. And it's often understanding that it's almost navigating a minefield, but law firms are very focused on money these days compared to the way they used to be. And I do see a lot of people that are in the practice law from money. I think that it makes them unhappy, and measuring their happiness in terms of money is not always the right thing, in my opinion. And then the other thing that I don't like is this kind of the spoiled rich child syndrome. And I think that everyone probably on this call can identify with that. And what that means is that these attorneys that are paid a lot of money out of school really start thinking that they're very much something. And even decades later, will think that. And there's lots of professional athletes, one-hit wonder bands and others that are often spend decades recovering from their initial stardom. And I think that the high salaries of attorneys early in their careers are often, honestly, the starting salary that an attorney makes when they get out of school after inflation and so forth, and is often the most they'll ever make. And when they reach the point of large law firms not hiring them anymore, or they have to leave, they'll realize that their market value really is much less, and they won't always be able to stomach that very well. They'll not react to that as well as they might have in the past. Yeah, so that is something that happens. So from a psychological standpoint, many of these attorneys will end up feeling like they've failed and can't keep up. They'll often drop out of the practice of law rather than take a lower salary or take jobs they don't believe are as prestigious. And it's very common, for example, for attorneys in markets like New York City to often leave the law because because they don't want to make less money practicing law. They would believe that's beneath them. And one problem I think with initial high salaries is that attorneys receive these have not always earned these salaries. And so they're not necessarily worth it to them, and they haven't proven that they're capable attorneys. So, what they've done is they've taken law school exams and maybe worked as a summer associate, but their work ethic and perseverance and things are not necessarily something that the law firms have tested. So their legal skills aren't developed, and they don't really understand what practicing law is, and they haven't demonstrated loyalty inside of the law firm yet. And many are more likely than not to leave in a few years. And in most cases, they're not even profitable to the firm yet, and they may not be committed to the practice area of a law firm. And in the majority of cases, working on a law firm is actually their first job. And they unfortunately have excellent careers, but many fail once the market realities of why they're being paid so much catch up with them. And they will often continue to believe that they're worth a lot of money, even later, even decades later. And I just don't like it. I think that a lot of the attorneys are plopped into very highly paid environments without any experience. They believe that they've earned the right kind of to practice at this level, and then they often have the illusion of their own competence when they're not really very well suited to practicing law. So this is what I believe results in the kind of the spoiled child syndrome. And by that, I mean that a spoiled child is given everything they want when they're young. They're given money, cars, clothes, and so forth. And they often believe they have a sense of entitlement, that they don't want to work as hard as their peers. And they'll often fail and develop problems later in life when the real world catches up with them. And it's often the people from the less privileged backgrounds that have the motivation to succeed. Because if you give a child everything early on, then it can hurt them far more later on. So when a child gives a parent everything that they're often trying to prove something to themselves or even their own parents. They can show other parents that they're wealthy. So the parents trying to prove something, and they show that through the things they do for their children. They can prove to themselves that they're successful by the things they do to their children because they would never had it so good. And so parents will spend a lot of money on their children, not to help their children, but just to often help their own self-esteem. And when a law firm pays a young attorney more than the attorney's worth, a law firm is often spending this money because it's trying to prove something to other law firms. By saying that they pay the highest salaries, they may believe that they look good. By saying that they're able to pay what the best firms do, they may look good even though they're servicing smaller companies. And then just trying to look as successful as other firms do. And in just 1 second, I'm going to check on something here. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so then a law firm can often say that they're as good as other firms because of that. And one thing that I see quite often is when law firms pay giant initial salaries to an associate, the associate will start thinking that that's really what they're worth. And so when they start looking at other jobs, what happens is, and instead of accepting jobs that really more adequately show their worth, what they do is they will often refuse to work anything in practicing law if it doesn't look, as good to them, which is, to me, is very disappointing. So if it doesn't look like it's paying as much money. And then if they do take those jobs with lesser firms, then they often don't work as hard, and then they have bad careers because of that. All that stuff, in my opinion, creates a lot of other sensitive issues. And then just a few more of these, and then we'll take questions. And then the other thing that happens when this happens as well is that law firms will hold back paying the more senior associates and other attorneys what they're worth. So instead, they'll pay them far less than what they're actually worth. And what that means is once an attorney has practiced law for a few years, what ends up happening is it becomes pretty obvious to their peers, the other attorneys, who really has it as a good attorney and who doesn't. And some people have the right minds to practice law. They have good legal minds. They're motivated. They may have shown they're loyal and have a knack for getting things to consistently go their way, and rarely need to have their hours to buy a law firm because they're efficient with their time. And in a good market economy, those same attorneys would be paid a lot compared to their peers. But in a law firm, that doesn't really matter. The same attorneys typically will only make a small amount more than junior attorneys that may have no idea what they're doing. And that doesn't, to me, make a lot of sense either. The one thing that's important to also understand is that for most law firms, they start making money from attorneys after the attorney's been practicing around 2 years or sometimes 3 years. And the reason, and that's really when the salary should start increasing. That's when the attorney knows what they're doing, when the law firm can give them work and it's very effective, and they're much more effective, and that's really the time to jack up salaries. The attorneys just starting out, and so a better approach really would be to pay junior associates about, in my opinion, 1/3 to half of what a mid-level associate that knows what they're doing, almost like an intern is paid less in a hospital than a resident. And then after 3 years of practice, elevate those that are going to make the cut and those that won't. And law firms, I think, that had the reputation for elevating certain types of people would, more people than fewer, would get more people joining them, and it would be a much better place for them to work. And I think that if a third-year associate were making 3 times what a junior associate was making, that to me would be a much better business model, and there would be more commitment. Rising through the ranks would mean more. There would be less. There would be less turnover. There would be more on the job learning. There'd be more money for those who've earned it, and loyalty and competence and so forth. There would be a lot more of that. And this is what happens with doctors and with internships and residency. I just think it would work much better in the legal profession. And in smaller cities and the least profitable firms, I think the issue with salaries is even more bizarre. And it's often punitive to the most profitable associates inside of law firms, because in order to attract the best law students, these same law firms are going to pay many times market salaries, but then they're going to increase the salaries of their associates until they become partner by many times only a few $1,000s a year. So these high junior associates often mean that their most profitable attorneys inside the firm are going to be paid just a fraction of what they're worth. And then there's what I call sort of the ultimate market paradox, and that I've seen, and it's not funny. I almost smile when I see it, but there's many law firms that actually pay non-equity partners and counsel less than first-year associates, and it happens in many big firms, and it's astonishing, but I've seen it. And you may ask why law firms would do this, and they can, because it's just what the older attorneys are worth to them, and they can get away with it. And even some of the largest 200 law firms in the country do this, and it's crazy, but it definitely happens. And then the other thing, when I talk about this, people don't believe me. I bring this up to people on calls and stuff a couple times a year at least, and people often don't believe it when I tell them about that. But yeah, it's what happens to many partners without business, is the first-year associates become more. And then the other thing that happens is when salaries are raised, it doesn't necessarily fix anything, and salaries are often just being raised for no reason whatsoever. So in the first time salaries were raised, it was in 2000. In terms of, it was a major raise, and it was by Gunderson Detmer. And the salaries at that firm, which was doing a lot of work for companies that were starting an internet type company, overnight went from $85,000 to $120,000 a year. And back then, the attorneys were leaving that particular firm to go to technology companies in-house, internet companies, and so forth, and often getting stock options and becoming very wealthy in the process. And this is because of the dot-com boom. And there was just a lot of very easy money going around. And the wealth that was being created sent a message that there were better opportunities for those same attorneys elsewhere. They went to other places. And Gunderson was very unique because it was primarily doing corporate work and had that problem. But despite the fact at the time that there was not this dynamic in places like Texas, Los Angeles, or other Bay Area firms where there wasn't all this technology stuff, when Gunderson raised their salary, other firms around the country started doing the same thing. And they did it not because they had to, but because they wanted to keep up with Gunderson. And since that time, these same salary wars have happened all over the country, and doesn't have issues with people doing mass defections. And when they increase their salaries, there's no reason for other firms to increase their salaries, but they always want to be the same kind of firm. And one rationale, of course, for the salaries can be inflation, but in most cases, when the salaries are increasing, it's not because of inflation, it's because of other factors. And another rationale could be it's very difficult, but it could be a junior associate. But again, it's usually not because of that. And in most cases, when the salaries are raised, it's not solving anything. It's only making conditions worse. I believe, that the salary wars are a bad thing, and I've provided you guys some solutions, and I don't know how seriously anyone's going to take them, of course, but I do think that explaining to attorneys that, especially if you're a firm that's not doing major salary increases, the risk of them could be useful, and having even different compensation models is useful. But the problem is that I've seen is when an attorney starts their career at a law firm that doesn't pay anywhere in the salary of a large law firm, like smaller law firms that don't pay high salaries, they're almost always practicing 10, 20, 30 years out. They may go in-house and do other things, but if you start your career like in a smaller market where there's not a ton of in-house opportunities and stuff with a smaller firm, you're typically going to be practicing with that firm or a similar firm in 10 or 20 years. It's just the way it works. But the problem and you'll be an attorney. So you use your law degree, you'll practice law, so to speak, what it is. But attorneys who start out at large law firms that pay very high salaries almost always are not practicing law a few years out, 5, 10 years out in a law firm. They're much likely to be in another practice setting, and they're much likely to be very negative about the practice of law and cynical and all those sorts of things. I always thought that starting your career in a major law firm was front loading your compensation and the money you're going to be making to the beginning of your career, because you're not going to be making as much money later. And it's almost like getting the most money you'll ever get when you're not ready for it and you haven't earned it, and then having to take it all away. Regardless of how talented an attorney is or where they went to law school, most attorneys, I think, that start out in large law firms are front loading their compensation. And then that money ultimately decreases over the time because they don't stay with a large law firm. They end up doing something else. And the thing is that it's almost, you have the labor versus the people that own the machines and stuff, which is the associates against the partners. But what happens is anytime the salaries go up dramatically, that you always have a short period of time where the associates feel they've gotten a victory and they're proud of making all this more money. And then law students start wanting to go to these firms, and everyone's very excited and thinks it's very rewarding. What happens is, and then everyone around those people too is very astonished. Their parents may be astonished by how much money they're making. The people they grew up with can't believe how much money they're making, and people seem to think that they've made it because they have this very high paying job. But in contrast, the owners of the firms, which are equity partners and others, don't often like this, because when salaries increase for associates, it becomes often harder for partners to make money. They have to increase the billing rates to their clients. That's not easy. They often lose clients. And so it makes the partners angry. And they often are angry with associates, and so they're not as nice to them, and the working conditions change, and they change not in the way they would at a lot of major firms that can definitely afford it. They change for a negative. And so they have to increase their billing rates. They don't like that. And then to make their clients happy, meaning to keep the cost of the legal work that they're doing lower, they need to give a lot more work to lower paid people. So more senior people that have higher billing rates, which would be senior associates and so forth, get less work, and junior associates with lower billing rates get less work because it looks better to have lower people billing lower rates on the work. And then this just increases the whole vicious cycle of inhumane hours, and then the things that people always talk about that are so negative about working in large law firms. And in an ordinary market, this sort of thing would probably be the sign of a healthy market. But in the legal market, it's just not ordinary. The high salaries often create conditions that look good to current and future attorneys, but have the opposite effect. And then the small difference, obviously, and it's not a salary differential of $30,000 a year is not going to make a big difference in someone's paycheck. It's going to be a market like California, maybe a little over $1,000 a month, if that they're going to get extra. So it's not, maybe a little bit more than that, but not a lot of money. And it's not really going to help them very much compared to the much more difficult life and working conditions that the salaries create. And I think that the attorneys that do have experience, that are trained and work 3-4 years of training and very good, are probably worth a lot more than junior associates, probably double what a junior associate is. But I don't think that so much money needs to be given to junior associates. I just don't really quite understand it, because they haven't necessarily improved their worth and so forth yet. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break, so give everyone a little bit of time. I know this was a long presentation, so maybe I'll take 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll come back, and then any questions that anyone has about any of this related to salaries or any other hiring questions that you might have right now. Thanks. Okay, so I'm taking Q&A now. This is actually my favorite part of the week. I love taking questions. So this is, let me just see here, started, and maybe 1 second here. I'm going to share my screen, share one, perfect. I'm actually probably going to change the screen that I'm sharing. Give me 1 second. Okay, perfect, okay. We're started. Second. So the first question is, what are some creative ways law firms can improve their business generating abilities. Yeah, I don't know necessarily about that. I think that some of the most creative ways of business law firms can generate more business are using SEO. So that would be making sure that you're being found by people searching for legal services. So some of the ways you can do that are basically having office pages, searching for legal service, having office pages for your website, office pages meaning submitted to Google. So Google knows, meaning Google knows that you exist, so you can make sure you're legal for that. It's also some other things are obviously lots of articles and content, which is something I'm a fan of about what you do. And then also sometimes advertising can be helpful, but you have to learn how to advertise, like online advertising. And then just look at what I'm doing right now. Presentations and so forth have always tended to work very well. And if you're, depending on the size law firm, most good law firms are seen. So being seen in the legal community, seen and out and about in the community is a good way of doing it. So those are some things that I recommend. Okay, and sorry about that first question, everyone. I know that I don't mind answering it. It's just I know that this is more of a discussion for. Let me just do something here. Give me 1 second. For things related to. Okay, hard time here with my screen. Okay. The next question: how can law firms keep their staff happy while cutting costs, ideally without firing anyone? So I think that one of the things that law firms should do and I think legal staff is a very important thing. I think many times people are quite happy with reduced hours. And so talking to people and seeing who's would be interested in reduced hours can often do that, because there are many times people that are interested in that. So that can help you. And because there's many people that are happy to have reduced hours. And many people are also interested in leaving that you wouldn't know. So taking that extra time to talk to your staff and know that see who's interested in leaving can often save a lot of money. And another way to do that too is to make sure who is productive and who's not. So many times if you're measuring the productivity of people and you're understanding who is being productive and who is not productive, letting people go that aren't productive or making them be more productive can actually increase productivity. And then if you can increase productivity, can make the firm more profitable, can actually offset that. And then the other thing too that's nice is just ongoing events for staff. And oftentimes without attorneys is a nice thing to do. Making people feel appreciated on an ongoing basis would be get-togethers, days off, group outings, weekend parties, that sort of thing. So those are some things I think that can be good. And then if your staff but I think the biggest one is when you talk to people and seeing who's interested in reduced hours or leaving. Because many times there's people there that don't need to work full time. And so those sorts of people will often leave. And the other thing, if you do need to let people go, then trying to let people go often based on seniority. Let people go based on seniority. Or giving people a benefit can often be helpful. So those are some things that I recommend. Okay, and then here's another one. What is the best way to measure a legal staff's happiness in order to make sure that they're happy with their jobs? Let me just show you something here that I think is kind of cool. Give me 1 second. I think it's called, let me just see here. I'm just looking for this thing. There's a tool out there where you can actually send, let me just see there's anonymous questionnaires you can send out. I'm just looking for it right now. Pulse surveys. Yeah, there's a site. It's called, and I forget what it's called. There's a really cool site that I like, and I believe it might be called. I think it's called. Might be called. I'm not really sure what it's called, but I know there's a site. It may be called Tiny Pulse. That may be what it's called. But there's a site out there where you can actually, but Tiny Pulse looks like a business. But there's a site where you can send anonymous surveys to people about stuff. Yeah, and I forget there's a bunch of these little platforms. There's another one called Poll Everywhere. You can do that. And then there's another, but that looks like one that costs money. But there's another one called Vevox, Vevox. And that looks like an anonymous survey. So there's a bunch of those anonymous surveys that you can send out where you can ask people questions and you'll get feedback. And I think people really like those surveys because it shows that you're listening. And it's very difficult for most law firms to do things like that because they really don't want to have bad news. And doing those can be very helpful. And you should make them positive. You should ask them, what can you do to improve? What would make people happier? And then if you get those anonymous surveys, then many times you can make improvement before people will leave. And a lot of times there's going to be negative things operating in the background at any firm. So many times the best way of dealing with that is to say things like, what do you like about your job? What do you, and typically like the best surveys in terms of when you design a survey, you'll start off with questions like, what are you frustrated about? Are you frustrated? Are you frustrated about? But then from there, you'll lead in what could improve at your job, improve at your job. Why do you think, what are other people upset about? But then you start listening then you start going into other questions. What do you like about you? What is your favorite thing about your colleagues? How have you improved since you've been, how has this job helped you improve? Questions, or what kind of work do you like best? So you typically will start off with negative questions, and then the way to really design these the best way, I think, is you start off with negative questions, because when the person starts writing, they're ticked off, so they write all this negative stuff down, and then from the negative questions you move into more positive stuff. So you'll move into, you improve, or how could your job, these sorts of things. But then, so people vent and they'll let all this information out. After people vent, typically they feel better. So this is a good way to let people vent and let them know their opinions. And after they vent, then you start going into, what do you like about your job? What is your favorite thing about your colleagues? Just positive questions, because then when people end on a positive note, then positive words to describe your firm, like that. So, because then when people are done, their final psychological, they do this thing where they vent and they let all the negative information out, and then their final thing that they do is then they end up feeling positive kind of at the end, and so then they're not left with bad feelings about your firm, and then they almost feel like a little bit guilty that they have said all these negative things, which you still need to improve, but then you let them do that. And so that's, to me, is the best way to do those surveys. Why should law firms invest in new training programs for hires, even if it's expensive at first? Okay, the idea with training is very important. So my mentor was Chet Holmes. He had 6 different things that he said that every company should do, and one of the 6 was training. So with training, you can improve the quality of legal service you're providing, or you can make people much better on your legal service. You can develop a team better. So you can, develop a team develop a team. So the people that do training together, people go through something. People will look forward to training. The skills improvement is a big deal. The branding of your firm is important, because your branding with attorneys, because a lot of those attorneys will leave and go in-house, and then those same attorneys could become your clients later. So there's a lot of reasons to invest, especially with new attorneys. And so I would recommend that every law firm should do what they can to invest in lots of training, and good training, because you can help people improve. And then there's other things too. There's technical training, but there's also soft training. There's technical. I'm sorry, let me just fix this here. There's technical training versus soft training. So soft training is things like personal relations and all that sort of stuff, personal relationships, leadership, the sort of stuff that I would teach if I was doing training. I would teach how to be a good attorney, all those sorts of things, career advice, all those. So if you can teach those sorts of things, that can be very helpful too. Okay, what are some ways that law firms can make their employees feel valued? So a lot of times, like someone was explaining this to me at one point, and I don't know why I was saying this, but the best HR companies will always do a very good job with training people. So the best HR companies will make sure that the people that are trained by them, the people that work inside of a company are valued. So they'll do things, they'll do birthdays, they'll draw attention, they'll catch people doing things right, and they'll do birthdays, they'll do group outings, they will do parties, holiday parties, all those sorts of things. And people like that, makes employees feel valued. But some other stuff that they can do as well that you can make an employee feel valued are things like individual things. So if somebody prays from important people, so that would be things like emails to the whole staff about something, emails or Slack or whatever. emails and notifications, to the whole staff about someone, including staff members, attorneys, and staff members. Public praising, employee of the month. I'm trying to think of what else. Just all sorts of things like that. Public, any sort of public approval really goes a long way, and that makes people feel good. Public approval, and then increased responsibility, all those, that sort of stuff. So those are some of the ways that people can feel valued, I think, and telling them that they're appreciated, and then also listening. So listening and asking for feedback. And these are great questions, by the way. Whoever's asking these, I really appreciate some of these because these are things that'll help a lot of other people. How does one know if their law firm has a good culture or not? I think one of the ways to figure out if you have a good culture in your law firm is often to ask the people to see even if you have a culture. So different law firms have different types of cultures. And depending on the type of culture, it can benefit you or not. But the best cultures are ones that will attract people and will attract the people you want, the sorts of people you attract and keep sorts of people you want, like attorneys, staff, and so on. That's what I would think. And then also, if you do you know what the culture is? Does everyone know what the culture is? Are there certain things that are important in the firm that people can point to that where the culture means something? Our firm, for example, has a culture. Someone asked some other questions here about, these are questions that when we do public meetings with different staff each week, we ask these questions, and you can see that they're very positive in nature. So everyone in our company and staff has to go through and answer these 3 questions, and we do it publicly each week. And so if someone did something, we tell them congratulations and that sort of thing. So that makes people feel good. The other thing that we do in terms of our culture is we have a set of core values. So these are things that we go through with our attorneys each week, or with our staff each week, to basically talk about what our core values are as a company. And this is what our culture is. And so we always go through, and one of our staff members will read this at the beginning of each meeting, and we do this in all of our meetings. And then we also, in order to make sure that we're doing a good job with our culture, we have certain standards and promises. So we make promises to our candidates where we say we're always going to find the good in you. We're going to send you the best jobs. That's part of our culture. We send them things at a speed that works. We always get their approval. We prepare professional application materials. We do all these things and available and coach and educate. So we have a certain culture, the things that our clients know about too, which are our candidates. We have the same thing for law firms, which are probably listening. And then we tell people that we're there for them and we help them in each step of the way. And then we also have, these are cultural questions you're asking, but I think all law firms should do this sort of thing. We also have a culture where every week we give things, we give out book summaries, and we tell people about those books and to help them, and that's helpful. And then we also have kind of a creed that we read, that someone reads at the end of each meeting, which talks about what our culture is. So our culture basically is we're a team to get attorneys jobs, and the people that belong here are the ones that are doing their absolute best and committed, or if they can't, they need to improve, and if they don't, they need to leave. And we talk about how we improve and connect with people and law firms, and I'm trying to connect with law firms right now. This is part of what we do, and learn about the market, share information, and then some of the things that we stand for. We know what we stand for, but we also know what we don't stand for. So we don't stand for things like money over performing their jobs, and not cutting corners, not improving. So having a culture as a firm is very important. And that's something that we take very seriously, and every law firm should, I think, as well. Okay, here's another good question that I appreciate. I love all these questions and I appreciate them. Thank you for asking the questions you have. I apologize if you mentioned this, but what do you do to tell a firm, let's see. Oh, I apologize for mentioning this, but what do you tell a firm to do then if they really shouldn't be raising junior salaries to keep up other firms that are doing that, which is degrading their brand as you described it? Do they just try to raise them for certain candidates to particular need and raise them a bit, but not as much as other firms, so they're entirely left out? I'm thinking in the context of litigation-only firms in the insurance defense area primarily. Thank you. So that's great. So in the insurance defense areas, and that's a good point. So it depends on the type of insurance defense you're doing, but insurance defense firms really, they typically can't afford to raise rates because you're working for insurance companies, and insurance companies are not paying the same salaries as paying the same rates as big law firms. And you can still, do well as an insurance defense attorney, as a partner or whatever, but you just can't pay as much money. So why even try to compete? You have to offer other benefits that you might not normally offer. Now, if I was an insurance defense firm, and I'm not, what I would do is I would probably, and this is just how I would think about it, but from a business standpoint, if you really wanted to attract the cream of the crop attorneys, I would have certain cream of the crop attorneys and probably in a major market or in a certain market. And then I would do a lot of the work of the briefing, the writing and stuff. I would probably put in smaller markets with attorneys that don't make as much. That's how I would do it. So I would open offices in smaller cities where I would just have a lot of the writing and the discovery and all that stuff done. And then I would have my highest paid attorneys, if I wanted to attract really good people to be client facing, I would have them work in the bigger cities and pay them more. But you can't, in insurance defense, you can't really pay the same rates. And the thing is, and there's also like insurance attorneys and litigators. So compared to other practice areas, there's just so many insurance attorneys and stuff out there. So there's no reason, and litigators, that most law firms have to pay the same salaries unless they want to attract the top law school graduates and so forth. But in most cases, they don't need to. So in honestly, if you're an insurance firm and you really want to hire people, like if you hire more senior people that have that you can get more senior people that have a hard time finding jobs in major firms, you can get those type of qualifications. So you just have to understand that. And it can degrade a brand, but the brand is only degraded to the extent that that you need to keep up with the major firms. And the only firms that need to keep up with that are going to be really the largest law firms trying to attract the biggest people that need and want to have the most important clients and so forth. But if it's not important, then you can do it that way. So your options really would be senior attorneys that cannot get jobs in large law firms because they don't have business, with great qualifications. Another option would be attorneys from the most expensive attorneys, the highest quality in major cities, outsource to smaller markets. I wouldn't call it outsource. I would just say hire lower paid people. So that's how I would do it and then run. So if you could do things that way, that probably would help you. That would be the way I would recommend approaching the situation. Okay. What is the most important thing? And if you have a follow-up question to that, I'm going to love to answer it. But that's a great question based on today's presentation. What is the most important thing for a lawyer to have to stay motivated at work? Lawyers can stay motivated at work. I would think they have to have a passion for the work. They have to have hope in the future, a desire to improve. And the big one, which is funny, is often obligations, which means family, cars, student loan payments, all that sort of stuff. So it used to be that law firms really liked it when they would always encourage their attorneys to buy homes, to do all those sorts of things, and to really settle down, because they knew if the attorneys settled down, they would need to make money over the long term. And that would keep them motivated. Why do so many people leave law firms after less than 5 years, and what can be done to stop this trend? So many, I would just say, attorneys. The reason is because the work is if you think about anything, it's a lack of hope for the future. So they don't like the way the future would look. They don't like that. They don't like, they're tired, burned out, spirits crushed. They believe that they'd be better off doing something else. They feel unappreciated. They're stressed, and life does not look good. And many times, I think when I talk to people, I believe that much of this is confined to large cities. And that's because that's where most of the money is. So that's where the most demands are. And then in smaller markets, not as much. So I believe that people, when they work in smaller markets, typically are more likely to stay with firms much longer than they would otherwise, maybe in a smaller market. So I think that it's very important for attorneys to really do what they can. Not attorneys, but for law firms to do what they can to really not be in the larger firms, to make it difficult for people. So, some of the things they can do are give people a hope for the future. So they tell them you're on the right track, all that sort of stuff. And that's what law firms typically will do with middle level associates. When they get profitable, the best ones will check in and make sure the attorney is doing well, and try to be encouraging, make it fun. They will do things that get people excited. So they will give them often increased responsibility, that sort of thing. Humility, public recognition, and then unappreciated public recognition, money, encouraging healthy activities, which doesn't happen very much, and that sort of thing. So these are just some things that law firms can do to make people do much better. And I know that it doesn't always work that way, but certainly if law firms do this, and I think the big one is, and the other reason that people leave many times is they're just not suited for the practice of law in a large law firm, or good at it, not good at it, wrong temperament, and so forth. So those are some of the big things I think that keep people away. What should you do if you're not sure how to answer questions from potential clients about what their case entails and whether or not they should hire your services in a law firm? Then you should spend some time researching it, or tell them you need a retainer in order to get more information from them, or to investigate their stuff. Typically, you need to answer a lot more questions and do a lot more research in order to understand this sort of stuff. Okay. Why is it important to have open dialogue with your employees about cost cutting measures? So there's a couple of different ways that law firms will typically do cost cutting things. One of the things that law firms will do when they're doing cost cutting is they won't do measures, and they won't discuss things that are cost cutting. They'll actually put the blame on the attorneys. So many firms put the blame on the attorneys. And the problem is when someone is young, 25 or 27, and they're just out newly in the workforce, they don't really know how to process that information. Young attorneys, and some attorneys in general cannot process reasons for being rejected, or if you give them negative feedback, and this is what a lot of law firms do because they want to protect their public image. If you tell the attorney that it's all because of them and they did something wrong and they're at fault, then many times that's going to crush them. So having an open dialogue is basically just saying the market slowed down, we're having these business problems and so forth, and this is what's going on. Law firms don't like to do that because they're worried it'll get back to their clients, and then their clients will also jump ship and think that their services aren't as desirable, which is a fair, or try to push down on their billing rates, which again is a fair fear. But it's not a good idea for law firms really to put the blame on their attorneys. So you need to be very careful. I believe that when you're trying to do cost-cutting measures, you should often just talk to people and see if the people would be interested in reduced hours, would they be what they would accept, before you just slash and burn attorneys. But you need to be, the open dialogue is often meant to just say, we don't have enough work. Would you be willing to go half time? Would you be willing to take some time off? You just come at it in a bunch of different ways. And some attorneys will be very open to it, others won't. And then the ones that are open to it will often save you quite a bit of money right away. But you need to be careful with it, because if you go too far with it, then you'll lose good people often that you don't want to lose. Telling the people that you want to keep right off the bat when all this stuff's going on that you want to keep them, and then the other people letting them know that there may be. Okay, and then the final question is, what are the benefits of a happy workforce for law firms and their clients? And so the main benefit is that if the people are happy, then the work is going to be more thorough. The attorney is going to do the work, so the people are probably the client is going to have a better relationship, and have a better relationship with their attorney, and likely to have an attorney that sticks around. And attorneys will not leave, so which is continuity of representation, all that sort of thing. And then clients, when they form relationships with an attorney, like having that same person around for a long period of time. Okay, thank you, everybody. And I appreciate everyone coming to the webinar today. And we do these webinars on Wednesdays for attorneys, and that's usually very well attended. And then Thursdays, we do it for law firms. And I will be doing this again next week. And then if you're one of our clients, we always, try to tell you in advance what the webinar is going to be about, and the reports you get every other Monday, and then also with our submissions. But I certainly appreciate everyone talking to me or being part of this today, and the questions that you answered. And I will talk to you next week. Thanks.